It's my pleasure to moderate through the panel number 2, which we are going to talk about the FABEC's first achievement. And I use the singular because it's an achievement. It's the basic ATCO Common Core training we've done, and we needed 5 years for it. And the first speaker which will talk to you is Kevin Salter. He used to be the chairman of this FABEC basic course working group, so he was the one who is pushing us forward to really come up with the common core content. And he's a very experienced guy, 44 years in the business. So he is as long in the business as I'm old, actually.
You look older.
I know. And actually that's because of you, you know.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As David said, Kevin Salter, head of ATM at the DFS Academy in Langen. Also, and it was a pleasure to chair the FABEC ATCO Basic Working Group. Before we go into the presentation, a few things to discuss, and maybe if people were at the last seminar, if you remember, we went into detail about what we'd achieved and how we'd achieved the status in 2013 and where we were. So we went into a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go over that again, but I just want to give a couple of statements really about what happened and some questions we were asked from the working group level. Basically, what was the main discussion point was, why so long? Why did it take so long? And I joined in the working group 2009, and we tended to be on a roller coaster. And sometimes the roller coaster was out of control through no fault of the working group, no fault of the SMEs or the SPOCs, it was the basic idea of FABEC. If you remember, the FABEC we envisaged that would be in place didn't happen. So what was happening in 2009, we get the political change affecting the pressure onto the development, and in some cases, would it be a FABEC basic course? Would it be cancelled? And all these processes we were going through. And it was a bit like the roller coaster where you're going up and downhill. But it was in the dark, and sometimes you got to the top of the hill and you could see a light, which was the final result. And then all of a sudden, you'd go down and develop, and all of a sudden hit a struggle and come back up again. We had Cesar. That stopped the thinking. What are we going to do with Cesar? With Sarah. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to wait? Then CCC edition 2 came into discussion. Stop. What are we going to do? Should we wait until edition 2 is published? All of these delays came into the working group's domain, and we had to discuss it, and we had to provide guidance for the SPOCs, for the SMEs, and also present the feedback to the TTF and ask for their support. What did they want? What was their opinion? And eventually we got a very good understanding and support from the TTF, and we had the resources back into the project. Because while all of this political discussion was going on, what happened was the projects came up, people left, new managers came in. So it caused this disruption in the development. And I need to talk about that later on for the lessons we learnt for other projects. So we eventually got where we are, and to get there we had the approval to run a pilot course. The pilot course was held at Langen. It was held from August 13 until January 14, and the DFS students were trained by a mixture of instructors from the FABEC community. There were some people actively involved. They were actually teaching on the course. There were some instructors that were observers. And we had one of our guys, senior instructor, who monitored the whole of the 19 weeks. Every day he was in the lessons, watching it and learning from it and putting comments down so he could provide a report. So the pilot course was, even though it was held at DFS premises, was a FABEC training course. because it was supported by all of the FABEC members. And it was successful. It was interesting to see the development and the interaction. And it goes back to what we said before about, you have to compromise. Everyone has been mentioned already, everyone has the best product. Every SME has the best way of teaching a particular objective. And it could be something he's developed over years. And he doesn't want to give that up to have another method of doing it, and that took a lot of discussion, and the work that the subject matter experts did, supported by the single point of contact, who was an SME responsible for a particular subject, the work that they put in got us where we are today. The working group guided it, but the only reason we managed to fulfill the needs of the basic pilot course was the fact that the SMEs produced the goods. Sometimes reluctantly, sometimes it was a majority decision, wasn't a unanimous decision about a change. Sometimes it was a format of the way we presented information. Our mandate was to agree a content and provide it as a proved running course through running a pilot training course, the basic pilot course at Langen. After the course, we then had, of course, the observations. We had the discussions with the SMEs from within FABEC based on the individual comments, and we kept a record of these. Then we had a report written by the senior instructor from DFS, and we then went back to the drawing board and put in place what changes are required based on what we'd produced for the pilot course. We put those changes to the NSA, and we waited. And we waited. 2 weeks, they promised, and we waited. 7 months later, we're still waiting because the NSA had changed their processes. They changed the acceptable means of compliance to apply for a course. And as Beat mentioned earlier, we met in Zurich with the NSA chairman, and myself, Greg, Beat, were surprised to learn they've changed the process, and there was no longer a requirement for certain aspects of the approval process we achieved. But also, there was no longer a single point of contact within the NSA to deal with the approval request. So we'd been sat for 7 months where everyone could have been discussing the process with their own NSA. So this was a little bit of a surprised and annoying process that we had to go through. We've moved on. We've got the agreement now that Greg is on the NSA board as an observer, so that there's no longer the possibility of a miscommunication, because Greg is in the meeting. But it still doesn't resolve the problem that we have FABEC approval. The pilot course has moved on. We have version 1 approved, which Greg will talk about later, approved for Germany because of the change of process, which we weren't informed about. So we have FABEC approval to run the FABEC basic course in Langen, and the next one we plan to do is in October. The change process, because we only had to agree the content, the work is still having to go on because things change all the time. An instructor comes up with new idea. All of the different things that come into the change process is still ongoing. The main ATLA law subject, the ATLA subject, which is the backbone of the course, is still in the final stages of development. But of course, people have to plan and move on. The resources are then, again, restricted. So we have issues for the final phase. We hope to have everything finished on the table for ATLA by the end of July, so we have a complete product to place on the table with the instructor in October in Langen. We have the approval. All the content agreement is reached. It's purely the final preparation of the material is still in plan. One other thing that came up yesterday was in the approval. When we put the approval process in, we included, on the NSA request, we put in what was required for a common examination process. we put that in place. We designed it within the working group. We then developed a examination project team who looked into it in detail, came up with their proposals to smooth and streamline it. Everything was put in place and given to the NSA for the NSA approval. The question is now, they're not sure if they read it prior to issuing the approval. So you can see, even though the work that we've put in the NSAs to provide the FABEC basic course and to have the approval, there will still be resources needed, there will still be effort needed on behalf of all of the NSAs to get where the DFS are today by having a course approved for use, which we will apply in October this year. The commitment that was put in, it was mentioned again by Beat, but just interesting factors. All right, €1 million. That's 10,000 hours. SMEs working 10,000 hours developing content, developing the PowerPoints, the manuals, discussions, all of the aspects that are designing a new course entail. But that was on top of their normal jobs. That wasn't allocated time. That was on top of what they had to do. So this is, again, something we must learn from. Right? The SMEs can't be pushed into a situation where they're having to do things on top. We've got to learn from the fact that we've achieved this. It's taken 5 years when we expected 3, through various reasons. But again, the workload of the SME, the communication processes that we had to put in place so that people talk to each other to approve and agree a common generic content, that still needs to be established, and we still need to apply resources if we plan to do something similar in the future. Because otherwise, you'll end up with another 5-year project costing €1 million where we could save time, save money. 50 experts involved from all over FABEC. And again, the problem of, because it was so long, jumping in and out because they had other projects or they were abroad. They were outside Europe. They weren't available. Sometimes the other factor was, with the 50 experts, that they retired. So the effort they put in had to be taken over by someone who's fresh, may not have been involved in the project, and he had to learn and was asking questions maybe that the other SMEs had knew and been working with, and there was no need for a question, but they had to ask the question because they needed to understand the process. But one other commitment and fact that came out of the working group is that we didn't just talk about FABEC Basic. It linked to other things, even non-FABEC related, but there were things that questions were raised. You get a mail from another working group member asking about something completely different because of the working relationship that was built up. So I think that is also a good factor to say that the €1 million invested wasn't just for the FABEC Basic course. We've got a very, very, very good network now of discussion, support within FABEC, not just for the FABEC Basic, any subject within training. You can ask without any worries that you'll be ignored. You'll always get support, which is great. What did we learn? And these are the things that we must take into the other groups if we're going to bring a working group into rating training or OJTI, harmonizing of these type of topics. There must be clear and constant communication. That's an essential part. Look what happened with the NSAs. They didn't communicate with us that they changed their processes. It delayed the whole process for us and is now still causing concern because they didn't communicate. But again, that's even down to SME level, where the SME is on holiday, everyone's waiting for a reply, but nobody knows the guy's on holiday, or he's sick, or he's in China doing a project from his NSP that she's been told to do. So his focus now is on his primary task, not FABEC. So these are the things that must be learnt from the project we've put in. Interpretation. Very often in the working group, we would be talking about something and everyone would be nodding, and then you suddenly realize that they're nodding when they should be shaking their heads, or they're shaking their heads when they should be nodding, because the interpretation of what we're discussing isn't the same. So we have to ensure that the interpretation of what is being agreed on is correct. And that was an important factor to learn. We were talking about being a little bit insular, we can say, to be self-protective towards your product, self-protective towards your ANSP. We've heard it from two different sources now. We've heard it again now, because I agree. I had to compromise with my training. I had to go and fight the operations because I had to increase the length of the basic course. They were quite happy with the basic course we had, but the FABEC wanted a course which we could use for the future and would be a benefit by improving the standard of the student. But when it comes down to costs, they're happy with the product they got. Why should I pay for 2 more weeks investment in something I'm happy with? So again, all of this compromise has got to be fought for. We had to add a tower phase. We didn't have a tower phase. We had to have a tower phase because everyone else wanted it. I particularly would have dropped it, but if you look at CCC Edition 2, now we have to do. So all of the interactive work that we put in, with a compromise, it does benefit the product. And then, as I said before, resources. We must have resources. If we don't have resources dedicated for the next project, you'll do another 5-year project. So you have to give time. We did, don't get me wrong, we did plan time. TTF allocated agreed time. But the problem was, because of the delays, because of the thing, the resources were stretched, and the resources were then used for other projects internally because there was no pressure. So again, resources are important. Finally, where did we get to? Well, we closed the working group. On the 1st of April, I stood down as the working group chairman. We dissolved the working group, and Greg Hinson was nominated by the working group and the NSA, or EASA in this case, to take over the role of the maintenance control board because it had been established in April by the TTF. So from my side, I just would like to thank everyone that's been concerned in the operation. We will be doing it officially in a minute, but I'd just like to hand over to Greg now, who'll give you a bit more information now on how we will continue the maintenance to make sure the product is world class, because it is. Once it's there on the table, you've got to put the effort in, but once it's there, it's a much better product than it was before, and it will improve the standard of the students. Greg.
So, thank you, Kevin. I'll take it from there. A lot has been said about the way we've been working for the past 5 years now, and in the describing the ambition, orientations, what the objectives were, also the challenges we've been exposed to, and so this has taken us to this point. And so what I'll try and do now is just through a few slides. I'll try and keep this as short as possible. Just give you a quick highlight of what we're looking towards now. In other words, how we've been asked to operate for the maintenance, or let's say implementation and maintenance phase. So as you know, we tried to highlight this, let's say, to stress this in the best possible way. There are definitely two periods. What is before, what we've been through, so that I can summarize very quickly. The project itself, the working group and what Kevin's just told you about, the specification, let's say the identification, the creation of a network. And you'll see that the network dynamics is something which is an issue of its own. The training material development, most is done, still a few bits left, but most is done. The pilot course, the post-pilot course adjustments as well, taken into consideration so as to reach the version 1 approval. So that just links with what Kevin has presented and what you've seen so far. Now, moving on, comes the approval which was delivered by the German NSA, formally on the 15th of December. We got the information a bit later, but we got this information in April this year, stating that the German NSA had approved the this course with the adjustments and everything. And therefore, we moved into the next step. So from the post, let's say, April 2015 period, and which brings us into the implementation and the maintenance phase of this program. So that's where, indeed, the working group as such was dissolved, and we created the maintenance control board. That's just for the formal side. And then we had to identify exactly what this new group had to do. First came a mandate, of course, as we've been doing in the past. In other words, the training task force would identify the need and who would be doing this, etc. So came the mandate. And from there, we've been going through the details of it and the specification of the terms of reference. So I reassure you, we'll not be going into the details of that at this point. It's got flow charts and all sorts of things in there, but which describe the way the group will be undertaking the calls for adjustments and amendments and the normal, let's say, day-to-day life of the program. Also, the need for, let's say, the network encouragements and keeping the dynamics going. And when I say keep the dynamics going, as you may have gathered from Kevin's presentation, the last 5 years have been quite tricky because at some points we had a lot of, let's say, things happening and moving on, and then we'd run into a period where we were waiting for answers, and so everything would fall flat. Other people would get involved in other things and would start wondering, will this ever happen or not, etc. And there was a lot of energy required at that point to try and re-get the machine going again. And the time gap when we were waiting for the version 1 approval was one of those 7 or 8 month periods when a lot of people took one step back and got involved in other things. So the difficulty at this point is to re-identify who is still involved, who are the newcomers, and allocate, make sure that the mandates are clear and that everyone is back on top of this so that we can keep the machine moving on with this new phase. One of the first items which we've already started working with under the working group, let's say, period, but which will possibly develop in the next few weeks or months, is to come up with the implementation guidelines. So we've already got a draft version of that, and we need to fine-tune it. I'll come back to that a bit later on. And also keeping the, let's say, general environment into consideration, the fact that we have the new regulation out, and that within the next more or less year period, we'll have a significant first, let's say, big piece to take on board in terms of development towards already a version 2. Here we are telling you about version 1, but we're already telling you about version 2 that is to come. So there's a lot of work on our plate, of course. That gives you an idea of the, let's say, the way it's spread out throughout time. Now, without overlapping onto one of the presentations you'll have tomorrow morning from the NSA, the FABEC NSA task force, as mentioned by Kevin earlier on, we've been through over the past few weeks significant, let's say, developments in terms of understanding how are we going to go about this approval process. So I just tried to summarize this in a few slides, and I know Marc Alvarez will come back to this tomorrow and give you further details. We have this version 1 recipe with our different NSAs around the table, and what we discovered over the last month and a half is that at this point we have an approval which was delivered by one of the NSAs, and the others, provided they get the appropriate data over the next period until November, they will be in a position where they will be able to accept it. And so back to semantics, back to exact wording. I discovered the NSA world, and it's very accurate. Approval is not an acceptation, acceptation is not an approval, but I'm sure Mark will tell us all about that tomorrow. At least by, let's say, November, we'll have passed this whole phase and hopefully got this new validation process running and understood by all concerned. Now, another point which, in my opinion, was, well, it's a good opportunity to describe here, is to understand how this FABEC course, which we'll call the generic part, which is the common part to all of us, is actually going to be broken down into what we'll call local variations. These are discussions we've had with many of my colleague SMEs over the past years, and saying, well, okay, what exactly is common? What can we do on our own side, etc. And so what I've tried to highlight here is the fact that there is this generic part, which has now been approved, but which is only one component of the overall course. and which can find, let's say, local variations from one organization to the other. But the generic part stays and remains. Now, why is that important? That when you start looking at the reapproval process, we've been through approval, but we'll need to go through reapprovals a number of times, taking that layout, that means that each provider will need to turn to his own national supervisory authority and seek for an approval of the part which is his own. In other words, which will be a package in which there will be a generic component, but there will also be specific local or national components. The national NSA will look at the overall part, and therefore what will be tricky for them, and the meeting I had with the NSA task force in Brussels a few weeks ago was quite explicit in this way, is that they need to make a clear distinction between what is generic and what is specific, and see exactly how will they validate one component or another. And going on to the maintenance, let's say, issue, and how are we going to actually make this program move on, what is essential to understand is that the mandate which the Maintenance Control Board has is to focus on the generic part and make sure that the generic part moves on as per, let's say, the requirements. Looking at the regulation as an example, we're going on to the edition 2, which is going to bring in obviously components and affect what we call the FAB referential, in other words, the accumulation of pedagogical objectives we've taken on board. And so that will move on to a new version, but we'll only be focusing on the generic part, knowing that the local variation and the local specifics remain under the training provider's own, let's say, area of responsibility. And as far as the NSA is concerned, they'll still have to look at both levels. Looking at the implementation phase, these are just a few, I'd say, reminders. So now we are moving day-to-day, so-called work within MCB towards the fine-tuning of the implementation guidelines, in which we'll find documents which some of you have already seen or heard of, in terms of the guidelines which are applicable for the pre-sim and simulation part, which is not subject to exactly identical content, but common guidelines. In there we'll also find a number of recommendations regarding the examination process. There again, that is something for which we've had work done under the working group, and which will develop further over the next few months. From what I noted during the meeting with the NSA task force, that will actually go into a more formal format sometime in 2016. So that's possibly going to come a bit later in the time. We need to take on board the fact that so far we developed this course version 1 using the FAB referential, in other words, the Common Core version 1, plus a number of agreed objectives which were common to the different training providers throughout the FABEC. So that's what we call the FAB ref. Okay? And now comes in this new component, in which a lot of elements are common, but not all. There are some differences, some more, some less. It's not an exact overlap. And therefore, the first task which has been initiated now is to go into a mapping and saying, okay, this is what we had, this is where we need to go, exactly what are the adjustments. Some parts have stayed unchanged. Some parts which were only FABEC have become Eurocontrol, in other words, applicable to all. Some have disappeared. And so this whole, let's say, mapping process is, let's say, a process which has been taken on by ENAC as a contribution to the overall project. And so it's the ENAC teams who have been working on doing the mapping, but that comes already as one step down the line, because the tool which was used was developed by Belgo Control. So the tool was developed by Belgo, and it's the ENAC teams who are actually going to use it to provide, let's say, highlighting what needs to be adjusted and changed in the system. So what I'm trying to highlight here is it is a teamwork. It definitely is a teamwork. And each one is bringing in his own contribution from one step to another. Timeline, Kevin mentioned this earlier, is the implementation of the common course in DFS in October, which by retro planning has given us a deadline in July for the delivery of the training material. I'll come back to that just now. So, just a reminder, this is possibly mainly for myself, but the action list which you have on the table today is get that network running. get it up and moving again. Make sure that the people who are identified actually know that they are part of this, and get the new ones on board and give them the information they need. So it's gone through a contact list. Most of the SMEs in the room have probably been, let's say, questioned on the subject or have received mandate in this area. So as to make sure that they now know that they're part of the team and moving on again. All training material needs to be developed, needs to be, let's say, regrouped onto our common platform and available by July 2015, which is the agreed date as per the deadline set by DFS. And last one, which is in a way possibly provocative if you look at it this way, but it gives you an idea of what we are exposed today, is to have, on one hand, we have the FAB version 1, which is something we have. We have the CCC edition 2, which has been now, let's say, handed to us. And so we need to work towards what we'll call presumably the FAB version 2, but that's possibly the next 12 to 16 months work ahead of us. Hopefully that gives you a short picture, but an accurate picture of what's happening. Thank you for your attention. Are you done using this? There? There. And you can put it back.
So, as we had it before in the first panel, it's time to ask questions to these very experienced colleagues, the ones who pushed us through and established together with the SMEs and working group the version 1. Went to the roller coaster all the time, up and down. Went into sleep mode when we waited for the NSAs, and all of a sudden we're again there and had to work and finalize it. And as well for the future, like what's coming next, maintenance control board. And I have to say, all the SMEs, they're already working on the maintenance of version 1 in the background. Any questions? Good, if not.
Before we move on, what we would like to do on behalf of the working group and the TTF is to make an official thank you to a lot of people. A lot of people put a lot of effort in to get where we are today. Some aren't here today. Jean-Jacques Passaggini. If he hadn't had the vision at the beginning as the chairman of the working group, it wouldn't be where it is today. He drove it for the first few years. His vision of what he wanted and the pressure he put on the working. I was a member of the working group for him. He put a lot of pressure on and effort into the project, and you must give a big thank you to Jean-Jacques. Max Moritz from the DFS, and also from ENAC, Charlie Ritsu. Both put lots of hours in to get where we were today. They're not with us. Some of are here, and I would just like to thank personally Greg, David, Bernd, Carl, Vanda, the working group members that we worked together for 5 years. We had some really good times, and it was a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed from my side. And I think we've got a friendship bond that will go on until at least I retire in 2 years. Anyway, but from my side, that's the type of spirit that if everyone had that within FABEC, it would be up and running on operations as well. Definitely. But we just sort of were steering the boat, having been told by the captain on the TTF team where to go. The guys who did the work were the SPOCs and the SMEs. And what we'd like to say today is that we can't just let it go. So we've asked for all of the representatives that have worked on the project to be given a certificate of appreciation from FABEC, from all partners for the efforts they put in. And to start it, what we would, everyone will receive a certificate from their own provider, which they are in place. That will be received after the seminar at the ANSP. However, we have asked for a representative from each of the providers to attend today so that we can make an official thank you and a presentation on behalf of FABEC, and it will be Beat and myself who would like to do the presentation. One of the subject matter experts has had to leave because he lost his passport and he's just been called to the police to see if he can find it, which was Jeff Smith, but Bernd Slabusch from the DFS will collect it on his behalf. So, David, can I ask you to call them up? And Beat, can I ask you to come forward?
Now this is the part with the fireworks we had, so celebrating something. We go in the alphabetic order of the training providers, and we start with Belgo Control, represented by Carl Reuter.
I'm sure that Christine will find a place in your office.
Okay, next training provider will be DFS, and we just learned that Jeff is looking for his passport, so he's DFS is represented by Bernd Slabusch. A team which supported the whole progress of bringing up that Common Core content with a lot of effort was the team from ENAC, and this time represented by Patrick Vacher. LVNL, represented by the, I don't know how to call it, multi-talent SME, and in every subject he was, when we asked LVNL, who will be your SME in this? Yeah, it's Chris van der Stap. And last but not least, the little team I had the pleasure to steer for about 7 years before, from Skyguide, represented this time from David Wawrinski. Patrick?
Good evening. I just want to say some words about our work. So I want to thank all the trainers, teachers, SME, SPOC. You have a lot of names to define people who try to teach our students. And I want to thank it to each who participate to the development of this course. And I want to thank also the FABEC work groups for their understanding about our work, their flexibility and adaptation, because it's not easy to know what we want. And it was so difficult to implement this basic course. Indeed, it's very difficult to write and explain complex subjects in a basic and easy presentation to understand. You must know. So I want to finish by the famous Leonardo da Vinci quotation. Leonardo da Vinci, who was perhaps the first European interested in a practical solution to fly. The simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Thank you.
So, back to the order of the seminar, and the next panel will be coordinated by my colleague Van der Zil. Please, Van der.
Merci. You get them? You get them? Those people? Sorry? They come in front?
Yes, you can maybe know them. Valerie, please. Yep.
Valerie, Robert, Carlos.
And Carlos, please.
That's not you. So the last theme of today is beyond the FABEC boundaries. And we have 3 speakers for that. 2 of them are going to talk about the basic ATCO training. Today I heard that you should start with a definition about what a basic ATCO training is. I think we might disagree on that today. 3 speakers. I got Valerie Salkinov, who is going to talk about the basic ATCO training from the NET's point of view, and Carlos Felizardo from Portugal, who is going also to talk about the basic training. In between, we will have some news about the ATCEP. May I ask Valerie to start with your presentation?
How do I get to it?
This one?
You just minimize. Put it on there.
Okay. Oh yeah, sure. It's the wrong one?
Yeah.
Just move back. It's in program.
Yeah.
Program. Yep. Program.
It was 3.
04.
No, you need to go in program first, and then you go in presentations. Right. There you go. And pals. Right.
Oh, that's the one.
There you go.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll try to make it short, but in my short presentation, I'll try to explain to you how we're doing ATCO initial training rather than basic training. I'll talk a little bit more about basic, but I'll cover initial one as well. Within that, what our plans are regarding implementation of new ATCO license and